Eleanor Ashford lay sprawled across the Persian rug in her study, her body positioned at an unnatural angle beneath the mahogany desk. Her face had taken on the waxy pallor of death, and her right hand lay open, as though she had been reaching for something just beyond her grasp. A crystal tumbler sat overturned on the desk, its contents long since absorbed into the expensive wool beneath it. The room itself seemed to hold its breath, as though the walls themselves were witnesses to whatever had transpired in this quiet sanctuary. Miss Marple stood in the doorway. Having followed the initial surge of shocked guests with measured steps, she had learned, over the course of her long life, that catastrophe often revealed itself most clearly to those who did not rush toward it in panic. Dr. Ashford was already kneeling beside his aunt, checking for a pulse with the automaticity of professional habit, though his expression suggested he knew he would find none. His hands trembled slightly as they fell away from Eleanor's neck. "She's gone," he said quietly, and there was something in his voice that Miss Marple found worthy of noting. Not grief, precisely. Relief? No, that was too strong. Rather, a kind of inevitability, as though some part of him had been expecting this moment. Thomas Whitmore took charge with the aggressive competence of a man accustomed to being obeyed. He immediately dispatched someone to telephone the constable, another to send for Dr. Hartley from the village, and a third to ensure that no one left the house. Margaret Whitmore had sunk into a chair in the hallway, her hand pressed to her mouth while other guests milled about in a state of shocked confusion. The pleasant afternoon had fractured into chaos with the same suddenness as dropped glass. It was Margaret, still trembling, who provided the first coherent account of discovery. She had made her way upstairs to Eleanor's bedroom, intending to discreetly inquire whether her hostess was feeling unwell. Finding the bedroom empty, she had descended again and checked Eleanor's study, expecting perhaps to find her reviewing household accounts or correspondence. Instead, she had found the body, and the screams had followed inevitably. Inspector Graves arrived within the hour, a solid man in his 50s who carried himself with the methodical patience of someone who had spent 3 decades managing the crimes of rural England. To his practiced eye, the scene suggested poisoning. The overturned glass, Eleanor's position of collapse, the absence of any sign of struggle, all of it pointed towards something administered in liquid form. The inspector's preliminary examination suggested the poison had acted swiftly. Eleanor must have died within minutes of consuming whatever had been in that tumbler. "The glass," Miss Marple observed gently to the inspector, who was directing his officers through the study with practiced efficiency. "It seems curious, does it not, that she should have poured herself a drink in her study when the party was still in progress and the refreshment table was abundantly supplied." Inspector Graves turned to regard her with the expression of a man who recognized Miss Marple's reputation for keen observation. He had encountered her twice before in matters of village crime, and he had learned not to dismiss her seemingly innocent observations as the musings of an elderly woman. "You suggest she was already in the study when someone arrived to poison her?" he asked. "I suggest nothing," Miss Marple replied, adjusting her cardigan with a thoughtful expression. "I merely wonder aloud. Eleanor Ashford was, from all accounts, a woman of rigid routine and social propriety. For her to excuse herself from her own party without informing even. Her servants seems rather uncharacteristic, would you not agree?" The inspector's jaw tightened slightly, and he nodded to one of his constables to examine the study more thoroughly. It was at this moment that Marcus Reed approached, his charming demeanor somewhat restored, though his eyes retained a tenseness that belied his casual manner. "Inspector, if I may be of service," Reed began, his voice carrying that practiced smoothness that had so often served him well in Thornfield. "I happened to notice Eleanor departing the party some 15 minutes before Mrs. Whitmore discovered her. She seemed rather hurried, I thought, as though something had distressed her." "Did she appear to be heading toward the study?" Inspector Graves asked. "I assumed so," Reed replied. "She went through the French doors near the library and never returned to the garden." This detail hung in the air like suspended smoke. If Eleanor had been purposefully directing herself toward her study, then someone must have known that she intended to do so. Or perhaps, and here Miss Marple's mind began its characteristic process of sorting through possibilities, like a woman sorting through a basket of tangled yarn. someone had known her well enough to predict her behavior. The guests were eventually released to their homes, with strict instructions not to leave Thornfield and to present themselves for further questioning the following morning. Dr. Ashford lingered the longest, speaking quietly with Inspector Graves about whether Eleanor might have taken her own life. The inspector, however, seemed skeptical of this theory. The glass had been placed on the desk with considerable care, and suicide rarely accommodated such consideration. As the sun descended toward the horizon, casting long shadows across Orchard Bend's gardens, Miss Marple found herself standing alone in the entrance hall, watching as the constables completed their preliminary investigations. The roses that Eleanor had been so proud of seemed to mock the proceedings, their perfect blooms indifferent to human tragedy. She had recognized something in this crime from the very beginning, something that resonated with patterns she had observed in the village over months of careful attention. The village of Thornfield that evening became a place of whispered speculation and careful watching. By the time Miss Marple had returned to her cottage on the outskirts of the village, word of Eleanor Ashford's death had spread with the efficiency of wildfire through dry grass. Every household was aware that murder, for murder it surely was, had visited their peaceful community, and in the way of small towns everywhere, the speculation had already begun to ferment into something darker and more complex than mere gossip. Miss Marple's own telephone had rung twice before she had even removed her hat. First, Mrs. Prothero from the post office, breathless with the news and eager to share every detail she had managed to extract from those who had been present at the party. Then, surprisingly, Dr. Ashford himself, his voice tight and controlled, requesting whether Miss Marple might be willing to speak with him privately the following morning. She had agreed with her characteristic graciousness, noting the tremor beneath his professional composure. The following day brought with it a kind of grim clarity that only murder investigations could impose upon a small village. Inspector Graves had established a temporary office in the village police station, and a steady stream of guests from the garden party filed through for formal questioning. Miss Marple, having settled into her favorite chair with her knitting, found herself in receipt of visitors throughout the afternoon, each one seeking her counsel or attempting to gauge her opinion of the matter. Thomas Whitmore called first, ostensibly to inquire whether she had observed anything unusual during the party, but in reality to establish his own version of events for circulation through the village. He was a man, Miss Marple reflected, who could never simply exist. He must always be performing his existence for an audience. He explained, at considerable length, how he had immediately taken charge once the tragedy had been discovered, how he had ensured proper procedures were followed, how his legal expertise would doubtless be of great value to the investigation. Eleanor was insured, of course, he mentioned casually, as though discussing the weather, quite substantially, though I suppose Dr. Ashford stands to inherit the bulk of her estate. He was her closest living relative, aside from that distant cousin in Scotland. After Whitmore's departure, Margaret arrived, ostensibly bringing a casserole, but in reality seeking reassurance that the horror of discovery would not mark her permanently. She was a woman, Miss Marple observed, who had learned to make herself small and inconspicuous within her marriage, and yet her eyes betrayed a sharp awareness of the world around her. Margaret had seen something the previous afternoon, something that troubled her, though she seemed reluctant to articulate it directly. "It's only that Eleanor seems so agitated," Margaret finally managed, sitting rigidly on the edge of Miss Marple's sofa. "The morning of the party I saw her in the village. She was speaking with that Mr. Reed, and her expression was quite severe. I have never seen Eleanor angry before. She always maintained such control, but there was something in the way she was gesturing, the way her voice rose just slightly. It seemed most unlike her." This detail, minor though it might have seemed to others, registered itself firmly in Miss Marple's mental catalogue of significant observations. Eleanor and Marcus Reed had conversed in a manner that suggested conflict, and yet when Reed had mentioned Eleanor's departure from the party, he had done so with his characteristic smoothness, as though it had been a matter of casual observation rather than personal knowledge. Catherine Winters came in the late afternoon, her presence announced with a certain hesitation that suggested she was uncertain of her welcome. She was a young woman of perhaps 30, with the kind of intelligence that the village church had deemed unsuitable for any role beyond teaching village children. She declined tea but accepted a chair, her hands folding and unfolding in her lap with nervous precision. "I suppose everyone is speculating about Eleanor's will," Catherine said quietly, "about Dr. Ashford and what he might have gained. But I wanted you to know, Miss Marple, that Dr. Ashford was with me in the library when Eleanor must have died. We were simply discussing matters, but he could not have poisoned her because he was with me the entire time." The statement hung in the air between them, and Miss Marple noted the flush that had crept into Catherine's cheeks. Here was motive for a lie, she reflected, or at least for shaping the truth to serve personal interests. A young woman protecting someone she cared for was quite capable of reconstructing her recollections to serve that purpose. It was late evening when Frank Cullen appeared at her cottage door, his work-worn hands twisting a cap between his fingers. He had something he needed to tell her, he said, though he seemed reluctant to enter the house fully, standing instead on the threshold as though prepared for immediate flight. "I saw Mr. Reed go into the house," Frank said abruptly, "after Miss Eleanor left the party. I was tending to the garden at the side the house, pruning the hedge, and I saw him slip through the library door. He was inside for about 10 minutes, and when he came back out he looked, I don't know how to explain it, satisfied perhaps, or relieved." After Frank had departed, Miss Marple sat alone in her parlour, the evening light fading to purple beyond her windows. She picked up her knitting again, her needles moving with the rhythmic precision of long practice, but her mind was elsewhere, assembling and reassembling the pieces of information like a woman arranging flowers in a vase, searching for the arrangement that would reveal the true pattern. The morning of the second day following Eleanor's death brought with it a development that seemed to alter the trajectory of the investigation entirely. Inspector Graves arrived at Miss Marple's cottage shortly after breakfast, his expression carrying the particular weariness that came from a night spent reviewing statements and cross-referencing timelines. He settled into the chair she offered with the gratitude of a man who had learned to value a listening ear. "We've had the preliminary toxicology results from the poison," he began, without preamble. "Arsenic, administered in considerable quantity. The glass in the study contained residue, and we've traced the source to a bottle kept in the garden shed, used ostensibly for treating certain plant ailments. The bottle was kept, according to Frank Cullen, in the storage area where only Eleanor and he had regular access." Miss Marple's needles paused momentarily. "And yet Mr. Cullen could hardly have poisoned his own employer without considerable risk of discovery," she observed thoughtfully. "Precisely my reasoning," the inspector agreed. "Which is why we've begun examining who else might have had access to the shed. It's not locked during daylight hours, apparently. Eleanor believed in maintaining a certain trust among the village community. Rather naive, as it turned out." The conversation drifted toward the various statements Inspector Graves had collected, and it was here that Miss Marple began to notice certain inconsistencies that seemed to trouble the inspector considerably. Dr. Ashford had indeed confirmed that he was in the library with Catherine Winters during the critical period, though his description of their conversation had been notably vague. Catherine had corroborated his account, but had seemed unusually nervous during her questioning. Marcus Reed, for his part, maintained that he had noticed Eleanor departing the party, but had thought nothing of it at the time, a story that contradicted Frank Cullen's observation of Reed's subsequent entry into the house. "There's something else," the inspector said, extracting a small leather notebook from his pocket. "We found this in Eleanor's study, tucked beneath some correspondence. It appears to be a record of financial transactions, notes written in Eleanor's own hand. They suggest that she had been making rather substantial payments to someone over the past several months. The entries are coded, initials only, but the amounts are considerable. Blackmail, perhaps, or extortion." Miss Marple accepted the notebook, examining the precise handwriting that she recognized as Eleanor's from the invitation cards she had received. The entries were indeed cryptic: M.R., £500, dated 3 months prior. Then M.R., £750, 2 months later. More recently, M.R., £1,000, with an additional notation that seemed to indicate Eleanor's refusal to continue the payments. "The initials M.R. are rather suggestive," Miss Marple murmured, returning the notebook to the inspector. "Indeed," he replied grimly, "which brings us to Marcus Reed. We're investigating his background more thoroughly now. It appears his antique shop, while respectable, on the surface, has been something of a financial burden. The profits hardly justify the rent he pays on that high street location. Moreover, we've discovered that before arriving in Thornfield, Reed spent time in London, where he was questioned in connection with several cases involving the blackmailing of prominent citizens. Nothing was ever proven, but the pattern is suggestive. After the inspector's departure, Miss Marple found..." That evening, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor in the form of Dr. Martin Ashford, who arrived at her cottage as the light was beginning its descent toward dusk. He appeared considerably more agitated than he had during their previous encounter at the garden party, his customary professional composure fractured by visible anxiety. She invited him into her sitting room and settled into her chair with the patience of someone prepared to listen to whatever confession or explanation he felt compelled to offer. "I've come to speak with you because I believe you understand something that the inspector does not," Dr. Ashford began, his words tumbling out with the urgency of confession. "Everyone assumes that I had reason to murder my aunt, the inheritance, the financial security it would provide. But the truth is considerably more complicated, and I find myself in the position of protecting someone I care for while simultaneously appearing to be complicit in Eleanor's death." Miss Marple's needles continued their rhythmic motion, but her attention was entirely focused on the young man before her. "You refer, I presume, to Miss Winters," she observed gently. Dr. Ashford's face flushed, confirming what Miss Marple had already deduced from Catherine's nervous manner and her insistence upon his alibi. "Catherine had nothing to do with this," he said emphatically. "But she is in an impossible position because of her association with me, Eileen, or had become aware of our feelings for one another, and she was decidedly opposed to the match. She felt that Catherine was beneath our family's station, that the relationship would compromise my professional reputation, and yet Miss Winters corroborated your alibi," Miss Marple noted. "You were together in the library during the time when Eleanor must have consumed the poison." "Yes, but not in the way the inspector assumes," Dr. Ashford replied. "We were arguing, in fact. Catherine had overheard Eleanor's criticisms, and she was insisting that we end our association before further damage was done. I was attempting to convince her otherwise. It was a private conversation, a painful one, and neither of us wished to have it become public knowledge. So when the inspector asked where we were, we simply said we were discussing matters and left the details vague." Miss Marple absorbed this information with the careful deliberation of someone assembling a complex puzzle. "Tell me, Dr. Ashford, were you aware of your aunt's financial dealings with Mr. Marcus Reed?" The young man's expression shifted, becoming guarded. "Not until the inspector mentioned it during my interrogation," he admitted. "But when he described the payments, I began to wonder if perhaps Eleanor had discovered something about Reed's past, something that gave him leverage over him rather than the reverse." "An interesting reversal," Miss Marple mused. "One that would suggest Eleanor was the blackmailer rather than the victim of blackmail, which would provide Mr. Reed with a motive for murder," Dr. Ashford concluded, understanding flooding his features. "But Miss Marple, I don't believe Reed is guilty either. There's something else, something that I've been hesitant to mention because it implicates someone I have considerable respect for." Before he could continue, however, a knock at the cottage door interrupted their conversation. Miss Marple rose with her characteristic deliberateness and found Inspector Graves on her threshold, his expression indicating that matters had progressed considerably since their morning conversation. "We've made an arrest," the inspector announced without preamble. "Marcus Reed. We found additional evidence in his residence, correspondence between himself and Eleanor that makes his blackmail scheme quite explicit. She was apparently threatening to expose his past activities unless he ceased his operations in Thornfield. When he refused, she cut off the payments and indicated her intention to go to the authorities. He had motive, access, and opportunity. The case is solid." Miss Marple invited the inspector inside, and upon observing Dr. Ashford, she made the introductions with her usual grace. The young doctor, with visible reluctance, corroborated what the inspector had discovered regarding the correspondence and Eleanor's determination to see Reed prosecuted for his extortionate activities. The poison was administered between 2 and 15 minutes before Mrs. Whitmore discovered the body, the inspector continued, settling into Miss Marple's offered chair. Reed had opportunity during that window. He claims he was in the library, but no one can corroborate his account. The garden shed was accessible to him. He had been to Orchard Bend on several occasions for various purposes. The arsenic bottle bears no clear fingerprints, but that hardly exonerates him. After both men had departed, Miss Marple found herself alone once more with her knitting and her thoughts. The case against Marcus Reed was indeed impressive, constructed with the careful precision of a prosecution that had found its culprit and was building an airtight case around him. And yet Miss Marple remained troubled by a detail so small, so seemingly insignificant. That she almost hesitated to acknowledge it as worthy of consideration. She had observed, during her visit to Reed's antique shop, a particular arrangement of items in the window display, a music box, an old compass, and a collection of leather-bound volumes had been positioned in a specific manner, one that suggested not the random arrangement of a shopkeeper, but rather a deliberate composition. And more curious still, she had seen Thomas Whitmore, the solicitor of considerable standing, entering through the rear entrance with the furtive manner of a man conducting business he wished to conceal. The patterns were beginning to emerge from the tangle of events, but they suggested something quite different from what the inspector had concluded. Miss Marple set down her knitting and rose from her chair, moving toward the window where the evening light was fading to darkness. She had, she reflected, one final observation to make before she revealed what she had discovered. The following morning brought with it a development that seemed, on its surface, to strengthen the case against Marcus Reed considerably. Inspector Graves arrived at the police station with news that the chemist in the neighboring town had confirmed that Reed had purchased arsenic approximately 4 months prior, ostensibly for treating plant infestations in a small garden behind his shop. The purchase had been logged in the chemist's records, and Reed's signature appeared on the requisite form. The inspector seemed satisfied that this final piece of evidence had sealed the matter beyond reasonable doubt. Yet Miss Marple, upon hearing this news through the village's efficient network of gossip and correspondence, found herself contemplating an entirely different interpretation of events. She requested a meeting with Inspector Graves, which he granted with the courtesy due to a woman whose previous insights had occasionally proven valuable. They sat in his temporary office at the police station, a sparse room that smelled of strong tea and bureaucratic frustration. "Inspector," Miss Marple began with her characteristic gentleness, "I find myself troubled by certain details in this case that seem to have escaped notice. Might I inquire whether you have examined the arsenic bottle found in Eleanor's garden shed with particular attention to its origins?" The inspector, somewhat defensively, explained that the bottle had been identified as a common brand available through multiple chemists and suppliers throughout the region. The poison itself bore no distinguishing marks that would definitively link it to any particular purchase. "Then it is possible," Miss Marple continued, "that the bottle found in the shed was not necessarily placed there by the person who purchased arsenic from the chemist in the neighboring town?" "Miss Marple," the inspector replied, with the patience of a man addressing a valued but occasionally confused elder, "the evidence points quite clearly toward Reed. His purchase of arsenic, his financial motive, his presence at the party, his access to the house, all of it forms a coherent narrative." "And yet narratives," Miss Marple observed thoughtfully, "can be constructed with considerable skill by those who understand the mechanics of suspicion. Tell me, has anyone verified when precisely the arsenic bottle was placed in the garden shed, or whether it was placed there before or after Eleanor's death?" This question seemed to give the inspector pause. He acknowledged that Frank Cullen had confirmed the bottle's presence during his regular inspection of the shed the morning after the murder, but neither he nor anyone else had noted when precisely it had been deposited there. "Furthermore," Miss Marple continued, "I wonder whether you have given Sue." sufficient consideration to the matter of Eleanor's financial records, the notebook containing her coded entries? Have you examined whether the amounts she recorded bore any relationship to specific services or information that Mr. Reed might have provided? The inspector admitted that they had interpreted the payments as evidence of blackmail, with Eleanor as the victim and Reed as the perpetrator. But Miss Marple's question suggested an alternative interpretation, that Eleanor might have been employing Reed as an agent for some purpose of her own, paying him for information or services rendered in a capacity that remained unspecified in the coded entries. Over the course of the next several hours, Miss Marple walked the inspector through a careful reconstruction of Eleanor's movements during the months preceding her death. She had, it emerged, made several trips to the neighboring town, visits that had been logged in her appointment book, but whose purpose had been vaguely noted as business or errands. Moreover, Eleanor had made inquiries of Dr. Ashford regarding certain medical matters related to a condition that he had, with appropriate discretion, confirmed she had been investigating. What condition? The inspector pressed, understanding beginning to dawn upon his features. A matter of inheritance and legitimacy, Miss Marple replied carefully. One that would require investigation into family histories and the verification of certain crucial documents. The sort of investigation that a man with access to public records and a willingness to conduct discreet inquiries might undertake for compensation. The inspector rose from his chair, understanding now the direction in which Miss Marple was guiding him. He made immediate arrangements to examine Eleanor's private correspondence more thoroughly, particularly any letters exchanged with individuals outside Thornfield. It was within this correspondence that the truth began to emerge. Eleanor had engaged Marcus Reed to investigate the legitimacy of certain claims made by a distant relative regarding an inheritance from Eleanor's late husband's estate. The investigation had revealed that the claims were fraudulent, constructed upon forged documents and false genealogies. Eleanor, having received this information, had then taken the extraordinary step of confronting the individual responsible for the fraud, a family member whose name appeared in Eleanor's personal papers with increasing frequency in the months preceding her death. The blackmail narrative had been entirely constructed backwards. Eleanor was the one wielding information as leverage, attempting to force her relative to withdraw their false claims and disappear from the family affairs. But who, the inspector asked, would that relative be? Miss Marple's expression grew somber. Inspector, I believe you will find that the person in question is someone who was present at the garden party, someone with considerable motive to silence Eleanor before she could expose the fraudulent claims that would have destroyed their reputation and their financial prospects. Moreover, I suspect that this individual became aware of Eleanor's investigation and attempted to discredit Marcus Reed by establishing him as the obvious suspect in her murder. But how could they have known about the arsenic? The inspector pressed. Because, Miss Marple replied quietly, they had access to the same garden shed that everyone else in the village knew Eleanor kept unlocked. The arsenic bottle was placed there deliberately after Eleanor's death, as a false lead pointing toward the one person whom Eleanor had employed to investigate her relative's fraud. A calculated misdirection, designed to eliminate the most obvious person who might have known. The truth about Eleanor's true intentions regarding her investigations. The inspector's face had taken on the pale cast of a man realizing that his investigation had been systematically manipulated by someone within the village itself. Miss Marple gathered her knitting bag and rose to depart, knowing that the inspector would now begin the more difficult work of reconstructing the true narrative of Eleanor Ashford's death. The revelation that Marcus Reed was to be released pending further investigation created a considerable stir throughout Thornfield. By midday, the news had circulated through the village with the efficiency of wind through autumn leaves, and speculation had begun to shift in directions that made several prominent residents decidedly uncomfortable. Inspector Graves had, with Miss Marple's guidance, begun examining the financial records of those individuals who stood to benefit most significantly from Eleanor's death, or who possessed sufficient motive to eliminate her before she could expose their fraudulent activities. It was Thomas Whitmore who proved to be the linchpin of the investigation. A more thorough examination of Eleanor's private papers revealed a correspondence that had been carefully hidden. letters exchanged between Eleanor and a solicitor in London regarding the legitimacy of inheritance claims made by a distant relative named Charles Whitmore, Thomas's younger brother. The letters detailed Eleanor's suspicions that Charles had fabricated an entire genealogical history in order to claim a substantial portion of her late husband's estate, a claim that would have provided Charles with access to funds far exceeding his actual entitlement. Moreover, Eleanor's notes indicated that Thomas had been aware of his brother's fraudulent scheme and had, in fact, been instrumental in orchestrating it, as a solicitor with access to legal documents, and the knowledge necessary to construct convincing forgeries. Thomas Whitmore had possessed both the expertise and the opportunity to execute the fraud. Eleanor, having discovered the scheme through Marcus Reed's investigations, had informed Thomas that she intended to expose both brothers to the authorities unless they withdrew the false claims and disappeared from her life entirely. The arsenic poisoning, Miss Marple explained to the inspector during a careful reconstruction of events, had been Thomas Whitmore's response to an ultimatum he could not accept. The false claims to Eleanor's husband's estate represented years of planning and the promise of substantial financial gain. To abandon them at Eleanor's insistence would have meant financial ruin and social disgrace. Faced with this impossible situation, Thomas had decided that Eleanor's death was preferable to his own destruction. But how did he gain access to the poison? The inspector asked, though understanding was beginning to settle upon his features. The arsenic bottle, Miss Marple explained, was not the bottle that Mr. Reed had purchased from the chemist. That bottle remained in Mr. Reed's garden, untouched. The poison used to murder Eleanor came from an entirely different source, one that Thomas Whitmore had access to through his own residence. Garden treatments and pest controls are remarkably common in households such as his. He had only to acquire arsenic from a source outside Thornfield, where his purchase would not be noted by anyone familiar with his affairs. The inspector's jaw tightened as the full scope of Thomas Whitmore's manipulation became apparent. The solicitor had not only poisoned Eleanor, but had then deliberately orchestrated circumstances to ensure that Marcus Reed would appear to be the obvious suspect. He had mentioned Reed's departure from the party to the inspector with calculated precision, knowing that this observation would trigger an investigation into Reed's movements. He had ensured that the arsenic bottle was discovered in the garden shed, where it would naturally lead investigators to assume Reed had placed it. He had even arranged to have his own absence during the crucial time period explained away by his taking charge of the aftermath of Eleanor's death, his authoritative manner and legal knowledge conveniently distracting attention from his own movements. And Margaret? The inspector asked quietly. His wife was the one who discovered Eleanor's body. I suspect, Miss Marple replied with evident sadness, that Margaret Whitmore was entirely unaware of her husband's involvement in either the fraud or the murder. She is, from all accounts, a woman who has learned to see only what her husband wishes her to see. Her discovery of Eleanor's body was genuine shock, not performance. She is, perhaps, the true victim in this tragedy. A woman whose husband's actions have destroyed the comfortable illusion of stability upon which her life has been constructed. The inspector made arrangements for Thomas Whitmore's arrest that afternoon. The solicitor initially attempted to maintain his innocence, but when confronted with the evidence of his fraudulent inheritance scheme and Eleanor's documented threats to expose it, his composure finally fractured. He admitted to the poisoning with a kind of weary resignation, explaining that Eleanor had left him no alternative. His brother's scheme had been years in the making, and the financial security it promised had become, in his mind, something worth protecting at any cost. Marcus Reed was formally exonerated and released with an apology from the inspector for the distress of his detention. He received the news with his characteristic charm restored, though Miss Marple observed a certain hardness in his eyes that suggested the experience had altered something fundamental in his personality. He would, she suspected, leave Thornfield at the earliest opportunity, taking with him the knowledge that even a small village harbored depths of human corruption that rivaled those of any city. Dr. Ashford and Catherine Winters emerged from the scandal with their reputations, if not entirely unblemished, then at least relieved of suspicion. They began making plans for a future together, their private argument in the library having paradoxically clarified their commitment to one another. Eleanor's opposition to their union had been rendered moot by her death, leaving them free to pursue their connection without the weight of family disapproval. As for Margaret Whitmore, she faced the difficult process of accepting that the man to whom she had devoted decades of her life was a murderer and a fraud. Miss Marple made a point of visiting her several days after Thomas's arrest, bringing with her a pot of homemade jam and the patient understanding of a woman who had long ago learned that human capacity for self-deception was both infinite and, in its way, merciful. 3 weeks had elapsed since Thomas Whitmore's formal sentencing, and Thornfield had begun the delicate process of resuming its ordinary routines, though the village would never quite be the same. The scandal had exposed fractures in the community's carefully maintained facade of respectability, revealing the dark currents that ran beneath the surface of seemingly placid village life. People greeted one another with a new wariness, conscious now of the possibility that their neighbors might harbor secrets far more sinister than mere infidelity or financial difficulty. Inspector Graves had closed his temporary office and returned to his regular duties, but not before paying a final visit to Miss Marple's cottage to offer his gratitude and to request her thoughts on the broader implications of the case. She received him in her sitting room, where the afternoon light filtered through lace curtains and her knitting needles continued their meditative rhythm. "You knew, didn't you?" the inspector asked without preamble. "From the beginning, you suspected that Thomas Whitmore was responsible." "I suspected nothing with certainty," Miss Marple corrected gently. "Rather, I observed patterns that seemed inconsistent with the narrative that was being constructed around Marcus Reed. You see, Inspector, people who commit crimes under emotional duress, passion, fear, desperation, often reveal their guilt through certain tells, nervous gestures, inconsistent timelines, a tendency to provide unnecessary information. But Thomas Whitmore displayed none of these markers. He was composed, coherent, and his story was constructed with the careful precision of someone accustomed to building legal arguments, which is precisely why we suspected him less," the inspector observed ruefully. "Precisely so," Miss Marple agreed, "which is why it proved necessary to examine the matter from a different angle. I had observed Thomas entering Marcus Reed's shop through a rear entrance, conducting business that he was clearly anxious to conceal. This suggested that the two men had some association beyond mere acquaintance. Once I understood that Eleanor had engaged Reed to investigate matters of inheritance and legitimacy, it became possible to construct an alternative narrative, one in which Thomas had motive far exceeding what we had initially recognized." The inspector settled more deeply into his chair, his expression suggesting that he was absorbing a lesson that would reshape his approach to future investigations. "The forged documents. We're still working through the extent of the fraud. It appears that Charles Whitmore was already in possession of substantial funds when he initiated the scheme. Why risk everything for more? Greed," Miss Marple replied simply, "is often not about necessity, but about the assertion of superiority. Charles Whitmore was, from all accounts, a man of modest achievement living in the shadow of his more successful brother. The prospect of claiming an inheritance that would position him above his brother in terms of financial standing was, perhaps, worth the risk, and Thomas, in his way, was attempting to provide his brother with the means to escape the limitations of his own life. Over the following days, the details of the case continued to emerge through official channels and village gossip alike. Charles Whitmore had been arrested at a residence in Brighton, where he had been living under an assumed name while awaiting the disposition of the inheritance claim. His correspondence with his brother revealed a relationship marked by equal parts affection and resentment. Charles felt perpetually diminished by comparison to Thomas, and Thomas had agreed to the fraudulent scheme partly out of fraternal obligation and partly out of a desire to prove his superior intelligence and capability through his ability to execute the perfect crime. Yet the scheme had unraveled not through any failure of execution, but through Eleanor Ashford's unexpected vigilance. She had, it emerged, been motivated to investigate the inheritance claims not by any particular concern about the validity of the claims themselves, but rather by a suspicion that Thomas Whitmore was engaged in some form of impropriety. Eleanor had possessed a sharp eye for human behavior and had noted Thomas's nervous demeanor at a social gathering months earlier, which had prompted her to engage Reed's investigative services. This detail troubled Miss Marple considerably. Eleanor Ashford had been a woman of considerable privilege and authority, and her decision to investigate Thomas without cause suggested a personality inclined toward the exercise of power over others. Miss Marple found herself reflecting that perhaps Eleanor's death, while certainly unjustifiable, had not resulted from an entirely innocent exercise of moral authority. It was Margaret Whitmore who, somewhat unexpectedly, sought out Miss Marple during the 4th week following her husband's sentencing. She appeared at the cottage in the late afternoon, her appearance considerably diminished from her previous presentation. She had aged dramatically in a matter of weeks, her face lined with the weight of betrayal and public humiliation. "I wanted you to know," Margaret began without preamble, "that I filed for divorce. Thomas's solicitor has advised me that I may be able to protect a portion of our assets before creditors make claims against his estate. It seems I will not be destitute, though I confess I hardly care about such matters any more." Miss Marple offered her a seat and tea, which Margaret accepted with the mechanical gratitude of someone operating on limited emotional reserves. "I also wanted to thank you," Margaret continued, "for treating me with dignity during this ordeal. You did not treat me as though I were complicit in Thomas's crimes, though I suppose some might argue that my willful blindness constituted a form of complicity." "We see what we are prepared to see," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully, "and we are often most prepared to see what comforts us or allows us to maintain the narratives we have constructed about our lives. You are not responsible for your husband's criminal actions, Mrs. Whitmore. You are only responsible for how you respond to the revelation of those actions." Margaret departed an hour later, somewhat restored by tea and conversation, though still bearing the scars of her husband's betrayal. Miss Marple watched her depart with the compassionate understanding of a woman who had observed how profoundly human lives could be disrupted by the actions of those closest to them. The summer months that followed Eleanor's death brought with them a gradual restoration of normalcy to Thornfield, though the village bore the indelible marks of the scandal. The Ashford estate passed into the hands of Dr. Martin Ashford, who made the immediate decision to donate a considerable portion of his newly inherited wealth to the establishment of a medical clinic serving the village's less affluent residents. It was a gesture that Miss Marple recognized as both genuine charity and a deliberate attempt to distance himself from the taint of his aunt's manipulative nature. Dr. Ashford and Catherine Winter's engagement was announced formally in July, with the wedding planned for early autumn. The village received the news with genuine warmth, grateful for an occasion that represented hope and renewal rather than scandal and VO. Even those who had harbored reservations about Catherine's suitability for the Ashford family seemed content to set aside their concerns in favor of celebration. It was during this period of relative calm that Miss Marple received an unexpected letter, forwarded through the village post office and bearing a postmark from a small coastal town in Wales. The letter was from Marcus Reed, and it read with the careful politeness of a man attempting to express gratitude while maintaining appropriate distance. He wrote of his decision to close the antique shop and relocate to Wales, where he had been offered a position as curator for a small museum dedicated to Welsh historical artifacts. He expressed his appreciation for Miss Marple's intervention on his behalf, and acknowledged that her perspicacity had saved him from prosecution for a crime he had not committed. More intriguingly, he alluded to having discovered that Thomas Whitmore had actually approached him months earlier with a proposition that Reed should agree to take responsibility for any future criminal activity that Whitmore might commit, in exchange for substantial financial compensation and protection from prosecution through Whitmore's legal connections. Reed had declined the proposition, recognizing it as the trap it so clearly was, but the offer itself suggested that Thomas Whitmore had been planning Eleanor's death long before her investigation into the fraudulent inheritance scheme had forced his hand. Eleanor's threats to expose the fraud had merely provided him with a specific impetus to execute plans that had already been formulated. Miss Marple shared this letter with Inspector Graves when he made one of his periodic visits to Thornfield to attend to minor administrative matters. The inspector's expression grew increasingly grave as he read Reed's account, So Whitmore didn't simply panic and murmur. "Der Eleanor," the inspector observed. He had actually been contemplating eliminating her as a problem for some time. The question becomes, was he planning to murder her specifically, or was he establishing a mechanism through which he could commit crimes with impunity? A disturbing thought, Miss Marple acknowledged, but one that I believe reflects the truth of the matter. Thomas Whitmore had constructed, over the course of many years, a network of relationships and obligations that allowed him to exercise considerable control over others. He employed his position as solicitor to gather information about his clients' vulnerabilities. He used that information as leverage to ensure their cooperation in his schemes. Eleanor's death was not his first transgression. It was simply the first one sufficiently dramatic to expose the entire structure of his corruption. The inspector made notes, though he seemed doubtful that additional prosecutions could be pursued. Most of Whitmore's victims had likely been too compromised or frightened to testify against him, and the legal evidence of his coercive activities was likely to be circumstantial at best. He was, in his way, Miss Marple reflected, a remarkably clever criminal. His mistake was underestimating Eleanor Ashford's determination to expose him. He assumed that once she was dead, the matter would be resolved. He did not anticipate that her investigation would have been sufficiently thorough to leave behind documentation that would survive her. As the summer progressed toward autumn, Miss Marple found herself spending increasing amounts of time in her garden, tending to her roses and reflecting on the complexities of the case that had drawn her into the machinery of official justice. She had observed, throughout the investigation and its aftermath, how profoundly a single act of violence could reverberate through a community, disrupting relationships and exposing vulnerabilities that had been carefully concealed beneath years of social convention. Eleanor Ashford, for all her faults and her manipulative nature, had been a woman who understood power and how to exercise it. Her decision to investigate Thomas Whitmore had been born not from moral outrage, but from a kind of aristocratic suspicion, a sense that Whitmore was attempting to transgress boundaries that should not be transgressed. She had employed Marcus Reed not as an instrument of justice, but as an extension of her own will, expecting to bend both Reed and Whitmore to her purposes. Thomas Whitmore, in turn, had attempted to eliminate the threat Eleanor represented, without recognizing that Eleanor's death would create far greater complications than her continued existence could ever have produced. He had constructed an elaborate misdirection, attempting to implicate Marcus Reed, but in doing so, he had created evidence of his own desperation that proved ultimately more damning than any direct accusation could have been. The case exemplified, Miss Marple reflected, a fundamental truth about human nature, that those who believed themselves most clever were often the ones most susceptible to the consequences of their own assumptions. Thomas Whitmore had assumed that the village constabulary lacked the sophistication to see through his misdirection. He had assumed that the obvious suspect would be pursued with single-minded determination. He had assumed that his position and respectability would protect him from serious suspicion. All of these assumptions had proved catastrophically wrong, yet they had seemed entirely reasonable to him at the time. This, Miss Marple understood, was the true tragedy of the case, not the death of Eleanor Ashford, who had been a woman of considerable moral ambiguity, but rather the waste of potent. Yal represented by Thomas Whitmore's choice to commit murder rather than accept the consequences of his fraud. By the time autumn arrived and Dr. Ashford's wedding proceeded with considerable fanfare, the village of Thornfield had largely resumed its ordinary routines. The scandal had faded into the background of village consciousness, becoming anecdote rather than ongoing trauma. And Miss Marple, having resumed her quiet observational life, reflected once more that the most important lessons were often the ones learned in the smallest details of human behavior. The autumn wedding of Dr. Martin Ashford and Catherine Winters took place on a crisp Saturday in September, beneath skies of perfect blue that seemed almost inappropriate for an occasion marked by the lingering shadow of Eleanor's death. The village church was adorned with arrangements of golden chrysanthemums and deep red roses, and the reception was held in the garden of the Ashford residence, a location chosen deliberately, Miss Marple suspected, to reclaim the space from the tragedy that had occurred there mere months earlier. Miss Marple attended the ceremony in a dove-grey dress that she had worn to 3 previous village weddings, accompanied by her knitting bag as was her custom. She observed the young couple exchange vows with the satisfaction of someone witnessing the triumph of genuine affection over social opposition. Catherine had, through her quiet competence and evident integrity, proven herself worthy of the Ashford name, and the village had gradually come to recognize that Dr. Ashford's choice of bride reflected well upon his judgment rather than poorly upon his family connections. It was during the reception, as guests circulated through the gardens sampling champagne and canapés, that Miss Marple was approached by a woman she did not immediately recognize. The woman was perhaps 50, with features that suggested a connection to the Ashford family, though Miss Marple could not immediately place the relationship. "Miss Marple," the woman said, extending her hand with evident nervousness, "I am Dorothy Pembroke. I am Eleanor's younger sister, though I have lived abroad for many years and was unable to attend the funeral. I have recently returned to England, and I felt compelled to meet the woman whose investigation revealed the true nature of my sister's death." Miss Marple accepted this introduction with her characteristic grace, and Dorothy proceeded to explain that she had spent the past 3 decades living in India and had maintained only sporadic contact with Eleanor. Upon her return to England and learning of the circumstances surrounding Eleanor's death, she had been moved to undertake her own investigation into her sister's final years. "I have discovered," Dorothy said quietly, as they settled into a relatively private corner of the garden, that Eleanor's behavior in the months preceding her death was considerably more disturbing than the official account suggests. She had, it appears, been engaged in a systematic campaign to manipulate and control various members of the community through the exploitation of their vulnerabilities. Thomas Whitmore was not her only victim, merely her most prominent one. Dorothy proceeded to detail Eleanor's activities with the precision of someone who had examined extensive documentation. Eleanor had maintained detailed files on numerous villagers, recording information about their financial circumstances, their romantic entanglements, their professional difficulties, and their social aspirations. She had used this information to exert influence, to secure favors, to ensure that her will was respected in village matters both great and small. In many ways, Dorothy observed, Eleanor was far more guilty than Thomas Whitmore. He committed a single murder in response to immediate threat. Eleanor had constructed an entire system of coercion that had affected dozens of people over many years. Her death may have been unjust, but it was not entirely undeserved. This assessment troubled Miss Marple considerably, though she recognized the truth in Dorothy's observations. She had suspected, during her investigation, that Eleanor's nature was considerably darker than her public presentation suggested, but the official narrative had been satisfied with Thomas Whitmore's conviction, and there had seemed little utility in further complicating matters by exposing the full extent of Eleanor's manipulative activities. "What do you intend to do with this information?" Miss Marple asked carefully. "Nothing," Dorothy replied with evident sadness. "Eleanor is dead, and pursuing her character through the courts would only further damage the people she victimized. I have, however, ensured that her personal files have been destroyed, and I have made arrangements for her estate to be used to provide quiet financial assistance to those she had been blackmailing or coercing. It is, I suppose, a form of restitution that Eleanor would never have voluntarily provided." After Dorothy's departure, Miss Marple remained in the garden, watching the celebration proceed around her. The wedding represented in many ways a kind of redemption, the assertion of love and hope in the face of the darkness that Eleanor had represented. Yet Miss Marple was conscious now of how much of that darkness remained concealed, how many villagers were aware, at some level, of Eleanor's manipulation, but had chosen to remain silent rather than confront her directly. This silence, Miss Marple reflected, was perhaps the most troubling aspect of the entire affair. The village had been so eager to accept Thomas Whitmore as the villain of the narrative that they had been willing to overlook Eleanor's own considerable sins. In doing so, they had allowed themselves to become complicit in a kind of moral blindness that was far more damaging, in its way, than any single act of violence. She thought of Frank Cullen, the gardener, who had witnessed events at Orchard Bend with the clear sight of someone positioned outside the village's social hierarchies. She thought of Margaret Whitmore, whose marriage had been destroyed not by her husband's criminality alone, but by her own willingness to remain ignorant of his activities. She thought of Dr. Ashford and Catherine Winters, whose genuine affection had somehow managed to flourish despite the toxic environment in which it had taken root. The wedding celebration continued into the evening, with dancing and music beneath strings of lights that transformed the gardens into something magical and transient. Miss Marple observed it all with the patient understanding of a woman who had learned that human communities were far more complex than they appeared on the surface, and that the truth of any situation was rarely as simple as the official narrative suggested. As she prepared to depart late in the evening, Dr. Ashford approached her to express his gratitude for her role in exposing his uncle's guilt. "Without your intervention," he said sincerely, "an innocent man would have been prosecuted, and the true murderer would have escaped justice. I owe you an incalculable debt, my dear young man," Miss Marple replied with a gentle smile. "You owe me nothing. I merely observed what was there to be observed, and drew conclusions that the evidence suggested. The rest was simply the inevitable unfolding of events that had been set in motion long before Eleanor's death. The autumn deepened into winter, and Thornfield settled into the rhythms of the season with the kind of acceptance that only small villages seemed capable of achieving. The scandal that had dominated conversation for months gradually receded into the background, replaced by the ordinary concerns of approaching holidays and the annual village festivities. Yet Miss Marple, in the quiet of her cottage, continued to reflect on the case with the thoroughness that characterized her approach to understanding human nature. It was in November, as the first frost began to crystallize the grass each morning, that Miss Marple received a final visitor connected to the Ashford affair. Inspector Graves arrived bearing the weight of administrative closure and the particular exhaustion that came from having seen a case through to its legal conclusion. Thomas Whitmore had been formally sentenced to life imprisonment, his appeal having been denied on the basis of overwhelming evidence and his own confession. "I've come," the inspector explained, accepting tea in Miss Marple's sitting room, to share some information that emerged during the final stages of the investigation, but which seemed ancillary to the primary matter at the time. We discovered, through our examination of Thomas Whitmore's private correspondence, that he had maintained contact with several individuals outside Thornfield who were engaged in similar schemes of blackmail and fraud. It appears that Whitmore's network was considerably more extensive than we initially understood. Miss Marple listened with the calm attention that had become familiar to the inspector over the course of their interactions. She was neither surprised nor particularly shocked by this revelation. Human nature, in her experience, had a remarkable tendency toward replication. Those who engaged in corruption rarely did so in isolation, but rather as part of networks that reinforced their behavior and provided justification for their activities. "Has T led to additional prosecutions?" she inquired. "Several," the inspector confirmed. "Whitmore has, in exchange for leniency in his own sentencing, cooperated with authorities in other jurisdictions. It appears that his criminal network extended into 3 counties and involved property fraud, embezzlement, and systematic extortion. Your case, Miss Marple, was merely the most dramatic manifestation of a pattern of criminality that had been developing over nearly 2 decades. After the inspector's departure, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the broader implications of what had transpired. Thomas Whitmore had not been an isolated criminal mastermind, but rather a node in a far larger network of corruption. Eleanor Ashford, in her attempt to expose his fraud, had unwittingly threatened not merely one man, but an entire system of coordinated criminal activity. Her death, therefore, had represented not simply a personal act of violence, but an attempt to protect an elaborate structure of corruption that extended far beyond the boundaries of Thornfield. This understanding, while clarifying in its way, also deepened Miss Marple's sense of the tragedy inherent in the case. Eleanor had been attempting, however clumsily, and with whatever mixed motives, to expose something genuinely harmful. That her own character had been flawed and her methods morally questionable did not negate the fact, that her investigation had been, in its ultimate effect, righteous. As winter progressed, Miss Marple began to receive occasional letters from various parties connected to the case. Dr. Ashford and Catherine sent word from their honeymoon in Switzerland, expressing gratitude and contentment. Margaret Whitmore, from her new residence in a smaller village some distance away, wrote of her efforts to rebuild her life and her increasing understanding that her marriage had been constructed on foundations of delusion and willful ignorance. Frank Cullen, the gardener, had taken a position at a large estate in the neighboring county, where he was establishing himself as a respected member of the horticultural community. Most poignantly, Miss Marple received a letter from Dorothy Pembroke informing her that the process of quietly redistributing Eleanor's accumulated wealth to those she had victimized was proceeding smoothly. Dorothy had discovered that Eleanor's manipulation had extended to a greater number of people than anyone had initially recognized. Servants, tradespeople, and minor village figures who had all fallen under her control through her knowledge of their secrets and vulnerabilities. "I have come to understand," Dorothy wrote, "that my sister was, in many ways, a tragedy herself. Her need to control others stemmed from a profound insecurity that manifested as a hunger for dominance. By exposing her character, you have done more than solve a murder. You have revealed the mechanisms through which one person's pathology can corrupt an entire community. I am grateful, though I suspect you will understand why such gratitude is bittersweet." By December, the village of Thornfield had largely moved forward. Christmas decorations appeared in shop windows, and the annual carol service was planned with the usual mixture of enthusiasm and organizational difficulty. The vicar made oblique references to forgiveness and redemption in his sermons, though whether he was addressing the community's experience with the scandal or offering more universal spiritual guidance remained ambiguous. Miss Marple, observing all of this from her position of quiet retirement, found herself reflecting on what she had learned through her investigation. She had confirmed, yet again, that human nature was far more complex and contradictory than surface appearances suggested. She had demonstrated, to herself and to others, that close observation of behavioral patterns could reveal truths that escaped those caught up in the immediate drama of events. But most importantly, she had learned that the pursuit of justice, while necessary and morally sound, never resulted in the kind of clean resolution that justice systems promised. Thomas Whitmore's imprisonment did not repair the damage that Eleanor's manipulation had caused. Eleanor's exposure did not justify her death. The exposure of Thomas's criminal network did not restore the lives that had been disrupted by his activities. On Christmas Eve, as Miss Marple lit candles in her cottage and prepared for the season of goodwill, she allowed herself a moment of acknowledgement of what she had accomplished. The guilty had been punished, the innocent had been vindicated, and the village could move forward with somewhat greater awareness of the complexities hidden beneath its surface. Yet she knew, with the clarity that came from 73 years of observation, that the patterns would continue, other secrets would emerge, other crimes would be committed. And she would continue to observe, to deduce, and to offer her insights to those who had been trained by experience to recognize the value of an elderly woman's seemingly innocent observations about human nature. The cinder path toward Orchard Bend, where Eleanor Ashford had once walked in her pride and her corruption, remained quiet beneath its coat of autumn leaves. And Miss Marple, in her cottage, returned to her knitting with the peaceful certainty that comes from understanding that mysteries, once solved, always give way to new mysteries waiting to be unraveled.